Good morning and welcome. We are in AP English, and our discussion topic for the hour now is an introduction to Goethe's Faust. For those of you who know anything about Goethe, you know about the sorrows of young Werther. It makes sense that I'm wearing yellow today. Google it yourself if you're so inclined. Goethe makes a major splash by writing a little book called The Sorrows of Young Werther, where at the end a romantic lover takes his own life. It's kind of a brutal scene, and he wears yellow, and then for a long period of time afterwards there was this huge thing among the avant-garde youth in Germany and elsewhere wearing yellow to celebrate the whole project of, you know, making a choice for oneself and all of that. We turn, however, to Faust, and the place that we're going to go, because we're introducing you to Faust today, is maybe a little surprising. I'm actually going to begin with an introductory set of comments that takes me back a number of years to the early days when, for me, when I was introduced by a prof named Mr. Dr. Lawrence, famous humanities, philosophy prof. And I remember the first day that he came into class and he did what I'm about to do. And then, you know, this will be the launching point of our conversation. He walked to the whiteboard and he wrote down these words, and they're words that I would recommend that you put in your notes as well. A quote from the Republic: "The responsibility is with the chooser." So write these words down. God is justified. Now, this is the Jowett translation of Plato's Republic, a text you should be now familiar with. Book 10, passage 617, I believe in the Jowett translation it's 617e. And I recall that old man Lawrence, on the very first day, walked in and he put this on the whiteboard. The responsibility is with the chooser. God is justified. And then he turned around and he kind of quietly, as he liked to do, this old man, with these unbelievably steel blue eyes, and he kind of almost whispered to the group of us on the first day of class, "Primarily, I have to report a group of ball players who were taking humanities class because we had to, so that we could go out and do the thing we wanted to do at school, play ball." And he almost whispered and he said, "You know, I think it's harder to think for an hour than it is to dig a ditch for a day." And my buddy sitting next to me, refusing to whisper, said out loud, "Obviously, this old man's never dug a ditch for a day." And we all laughed. And he waited, Lawrence waited until we all had finished our laughing, and then he looked at the young man, and he fixed him with his gaze and said, "And I can tell you never thought for an hour." Whew. Yeah. Nasty but beautiful all at the same time. This is maybe what humanities profs love to do. That is to say, set him up and then knock him down, and he did it. But I want to begin with this idea. The responsibilities with the chooser, God is justified. Now, old man Lawrence at the time was actually introducing, of all things, Milton's Paradise Lost, which of course makes some sense if you look at that quote. This actually comes from the famous myth of air. You'll remember that afterlife story from the Republic, book 10, where he goes into the afterlife. He has this near-death experience. He dies, he comes back to tell everybody kind of what's on the other side. And on the other side, well, you have to make a choice. And that's where I want to begin. Because if you know anything about Faust, you know that it comes down to a choice. His whole life is about a choice, a really famous choice. For those of you who are "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" fans, if you haven't seen that text, I highly recommend it to you. When they pick up the young man at the crossroads and they ask him, "Dude, what were you doing in the middle of the night at the crossroads?" And he said, "Well, I came down there because this guy made an offer to me to sell my soul so that I could learn how to play the guitar." And the one young man says to him in the car, "Oh, son, you sold your everlasting soul just for that?" And the response was, "Well, I wasn't doing anything with it at the time." Now, jokes like that only work in terms of literary allusions if you know the story of Faust. Of course, Faust is going to be met with a monumental choice that Mephistopheles will give to him, all right, and ostensibly selling one's soul to the devil is born then in this moment. But I actually want to begin by doing a little bit of a review. Since September, when we've been working together, we're now ending our time together, I want to ask you to consider the fact that the majority of the humanities texts that we've worked with, at their core, are built around a choice. a choice, which is in some ways kind of fascinating. Let's play a game really quickly on the notes in front of you, where we just do our little Western history timeline. Of course, our 0 is the birth of Christ. We have those events which are before the Common Era and those which we call Common Era. And let's just go down the list really quickly, and let's just write down some of the texts that we've been working with in an AP class since the beginning of our time in September. And as you write down the title, I just want you to jot down a line or two that answers the question, what was the choice that was foundational to this text? And by the way, two things. One, there may have been more than one choice. Two, these may not have been simple choices. They might have been very difficult choices to make. Let's just begin, for example, out here somewhere between the 8th and the 5th century BCE, and of course the Homeric texts, right? So let's start with the Iliad, right? And then the Odyssey, okay? And go ahead and jot down, from the Iliad, what is the choice that must be made that seems to be foundational to understanding all of the work of that poem? We open, you'll maybe recall, with a fight, right, between Achilles and Agamemnon over, this will not surprise us, girls, namely a girl, right? Notice how Achilles has to make a choice in this text. What is his choice? To fight or not to fight. That is to say, to join the battle or not to join the battle. Then, with the loss of his lover Patroclus, his pal, he then decides to join. And of course, in the process, bringing to the fruition the meeting between himself and Hector, who also has to make a choice. Right? In the end, does one run or does one stand and fight? And of course, in that kind of famous moment, the decision to stand and fight becomes, you know, kind of central, right? Good morning to McGee. I'm lecturing. I will. You got it. Mr. Blue wants to see you at the end of the hour. That's all right. Think about the Odyssey as a required choice. So, Odysseus, first of all, he has to make the choice whether to leave or not leave Ithaca. Ultimately, he has to make the decision, right, of how he will respond to coming back home, and all those suitors are doing nasties to his wife, to his girl, and of course, by extension, to his son, and then of course, to his, you know, to his estate. Let's keep going. If we're working with these ancient texts, we also find ourselves thinking, for example, about several myths that are of significance. Let's just pick one of them, one we referenced a number of times in here. How about the Promethean choice? Go ahead and write that down because that's going to be significant to Gouda. The Promethean choice. Prometheus, of course, is going to defy Zeus to distribute fire and the knowledge of the destructive and rehabilitative power of fire. And in the process of doing this, his choice will have, can we say it this way, ripple effects, right? Let's keep going. How about this one? Virgil's Aeneid, right? Now, the Aeneid is foundational in the history of Western thought because of a very important choice. We think of the choices of Aeneas. He makes several, right? But probably the central choice is the choice to leave his lover, Dido, who he is supposed to marry, the Queen of Carthage, and then take over North Africa. But instead of doing that, he's told in a dream, no, you have a destiny. You have a fate lying for you elsewhere. You need to leave. And in the process of leaving, of course, he's going to break Dido's heart. She, in turn, will, of course, kill herself in a really dramatic way. And then Aeneas is going to go on to what we today call present-day Italy and the founding of the great Roman people. There is a pivotal moment of a choice. So you kind of get the drift here. Now that I've kind of walked you through it, let's just go down the line, and we'll just work with some of our classic Weimar texts. We'll start at roughly 750 to 1000 Common Era, and the text is Beowulf. Think about the choices of Beowulf as a great mythic warrior who has got to decide, of course, first of all, whether he makes the journey from the land of the Geats to the land of the Danes, where he then will decide to A, fight the monster Grendel, barehanded, not with weaponry. And then, of course, beyond that, he will fight Grendel's ma. And then later in his life, at the end of 50 years of ruling in his kingdom, he will decide to fight that famous, flying dragon monster, right? And in the process, of course, died. So Beowulf is constantly met with these choices that are going to have some kind of, again, ripple effect. We can jump forward. We can think about Arthur and his choices, right? So you can start writing these titles down. Mordred Arthur, you can start thinking about that one. Of course, in between, we studied Chaucer and Canterbury Tales, and you can think a little bit about how Chaucer had to make himself a monumental choice of choosing to write in this language, English, which is going to have a major effect in the history of English language and, of course, literature. Let's go ahead and jump to Shakespeare. Because if you'll think about it, that great Renaissance writer is the king of showing on stage choices. Can I say it without being too tongue-in-cheek? To be or not to be? That is the question. To choose or not to choose. And in fact, in that very soliloquy, he will even say as much. Conscience makes cowards of us all, right? Those enterprises that we have, with this regard, they lose the name of action because we can't make up our mind to choose or not choose. Later, you'll remember in that same play, Claudius will say to Laertes, that we should do when we would, for that would hath abatements and delays. In other words, we want to make a choice, but we're kind of paralyzed. We can't quite find our way. And on and on and on this game goes. I mean, as we are playing it, for example, I'll just throw, because we've just finished with that title, think about the novel Frankenstein in regards to choices. And one of the huge debates of that novel is the choice of the scientist Frankenstein to construct this, what we'll call, monster. That choice, again, has these ripple effects. Leading us now, finally, to Faust. And I'm with you now in the Kaufman translation, the very opening lines, the first part of the tragedy in your copy there. And we are met with Faust, who is sitting alone. He is the scholar of all scholars. So in other words, let's say it this way. He's kind of a Miltonic-like figure. He is a Promethean-like figure. He has, well, let's let him say it himself. I have, alas, studied philosophy, jurisprudence, and medicine too. And worst of all, the nasty irony and jokes start right away, theology, with keen endeavor, through and through. Now, one of the ways I like to kind of set this one up, and I mentioned this a little bit with Milton because I talked about him as this amazing cat who had this capacity to remember. What would it be like if everything you were exposed to from the very beginning of your life, you could right now call up in memory? Think about that. What would that be like for you? In other words, all the books you ever read, all the TV shows you ever watched, all the music you ever listened to, all the conversations that you ever had, either verbally or in form of email or texting. Everything that ever happened to you, think of your, for example, mind as almost like a sponge that was just absorbing, absorbing, absorbing. And then it had a Google-like lexicon that you could call up immediately any and all of those memories. Anything you ever read, you could immediately call up and you could remember exactly what you read, word for word. Now, there are a few individuals in the history of the world who seem, at times, to have come close to this capacity of remembering. Faust will be one of those guys. And he will say the following: I've done terminal degrees, PhDs, in everything. I've studied everything. I've read all the books. In our present day, we would say, I've carried the power of the internet in my mind. I've got it all. I've learned everything. I've studied I've been to university and gotten multiple degrees in all the major departments. I do not lack for, what's our K word? Knowledge. I don't lack for any knowledge. I know it all. In other words, there's not going to be any argument that anybody's going to be able to throw at me that I go, gee, I've never thought of that one before. Just jot down for a moment what would that be like? Because I've often had students that say, dude, that would be like totally awesome. But then I have other students that will say, you know, I'm not totally sure that would be so great to know everything. Why would it maybe be difficult to claim I know it all? Now, of course, let's just point out, there's always this thing about, we'll use Aristotle's word, hubris or pride, right? To say you know everything is always a very dangerous place to be. Because usually in the texts, right about the time that somebody says that, we're going to discover something, oh, well, I guess I didn't know that. But for Faust, he will say, I've pretty much done it all. I've tapped out knowledge base. I've done it in every way I could. Let's keep reading. He says, I've done it with keen endeavor, through and through. And here I am, for all my lore, the wretched fool I was before. A number of AP students love to read this line and point out, after all of the study, all of the learning, all of the wretched paper writing, see, some of us can just start nodding, I don't know anything more than I knew before. Now, what's ironic about this? You can write down, there's obvious irony here. Because you could make the argument that I know more than I knew before, but I don't know anything. Now, what are we saying here? See, put it in your own words. I know more than I knew before. For example, that little survey that I just put on the whiteboard, you're capable of following much better than you were last September. That, of course, is true. I mentioned, for example, Beowulf, and immediately some part of the story pops up in your mind, depending on how much attention, keen endeavor, you paid to it, right? So, in other words, you have to argue, okay, it is true that unless I was on some really powerful dope for the whole time, I pretty much know I know more than I did before. And yet, he says, I'm no different, notice he calls himself a wretched fool than I was before. Continue. Called Master of Arts and Doctor to boot, for 10 years almost I confute, and up and down wherever it goes. And then he makes a joke for all teachers. Students don't find this always as an interesting joke. I drag my students by the nose and see that for all our science and art, we can know nothing. Now, what's interesting about this is that right away, Goethe's going to start to play around with the penultimate game of choice in the Western literary tradition. Before I say it, I'm interested to see who can write it. Of all of the stories in the Western tradition, what is the story of all stories about choice? And in fact, that's a loaded question, because I can use the term agency or free will to talk about the idea of choice, and then ask the question, what is the literary text in the Western tradition of all literary texts that's going to obviously play the game of, well, this thing of free will or choice or agency, where did that whole thing start? And of course, you're going to say Milton, and you're going to say Paradise Lost, but that wasn't my question. My question was, what is the story of all stories in the Western literary tradition? Of course, Milton's going to play the game of Genesis 3, right? But what is the story of all stories? And of course, it's the famous Genesis 3 account of the decision to choose to eat of the fruit of the forbidden tree. Remember the opening lines of Milton's Paradise Lost, of man's first disobedience, right? And the fruit of that forbidden tree, right, brought death into the world and all our woe, he will say in the opening lines. So in other words, the choice of all choice stories is the story of eating from a special fruit named, tree named what? The fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge. Okay, so Goethe right away is going to play a game in Faust, and he's going to say, interesting question. What really do you get when you bite into the apple of knowledge? And for those of you that are familiar with J.D. Salinger's short story, Teddy, a text that if we have time, maybe we'll share with you, that's a wonderful word picture that Salinger will play the game of. What does it mean to bite into the apple of logic, to bite into the apple of knowledge. If we're Aristotelian, we call it logic. That idea that there's stuff you need to know, right? So for example, see right now, with just a few days remaining in your high school career, I could take you down to a bunch of 8th graders. And if you were legitimate about it, you would say to them, I'm going to give you 3 or 4 or 5 things that you need to, see we use the word, know before you arrive. Of course, the question is, yeah, I can tell them. But will they know it without the, now we're to the E word, experience. Now Goethe is playing around with a very important romantic paradigm that in many ways is fixed by the great Blake, the poet who is going to write 2 sets of poems, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. Remember that those 2 poems are juxtaposed in that classic 2 volumes. Songs of Innocence, Little Lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Remember the picture of a little lamb running across the meadow. Sweet, innocent, dare we say it, naive. In Songs of Experience, the classic text is, Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Later, dare frame thy fearful symmetry. And then he asks in that poem, did he who make the lamb make thee, the tiger, one of the worst killing machines on the planet? Tiger, he says, Blake says, I kind of get it. They're cute and they're cuddly. He probably never spent time around, bunches of lambs that are disgusting, smelly, and stupid. But the tiger? Why a tiger? Like, why would you create something like this? And how can you explain both of those? Of course, innocence versus experience is going to be foundational. It will be significant, of course, that in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster will learn to read. He has this amazing capacity to learn quickly. Learn to read by reading. See, Milton could have chosen, Shelley could have chosen any volume, and she chooses Milton's Paradise Lost. Why? Because foundational to choice. And here it is. Notice he says,